get set. We're riding on the internet, cyberspace set free. Hello, virtual reality.
The internet is a marvellous tool for the retro junkie. I usually find myself unearthing items of curiosity, which then leads to being up at 5 AM, researching further and further down the rabbit hole. This is the very situation I was confronted with last week. There I was, happily browsing through some retro forums, when this slapped me in the face. Streetfighter 2 Turbo Beta for the Sega MegaDrive. But wait, there wasn't a Streetfighter 2 Turbo for the MegaDrive, so what is this? And so the journey begins. After reading through several forum posts talking of better animation, different backgrounds and improved character sprites, I was hooked on discovering why this version of the game never made it onto Sega's finest platform. My first port of call was to seek out this ROM file from 1994 and play it myself. The ROM I found was 2 megabytes in size, so equivalent to a 16 megabit cartridge, and dated the 24th of December 1996. But clearly it's more than possible for this date to change from the original purported emergence date. I then sat and played what appears to be a perfectly reasonable version of Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, despite the logo claiming it's the Turbo Edition. We have a Sega logo with misplaced TM lettering, but we've also got a menu, we have music, we have a character selection screen, various stages and all the other parts which make up a completed game. This is in fact a fairly complete version of Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, but other than the title it has no features of the Turbo nor Special Champion Edition. So let's go back and cover a bit of informal Street Fighter 2 history. Developed by Capcom, Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior landed in arcades during February 1991, a follow-up to the more mundane Street Fighter from 1987. Bringing 6 buttons, special moves, multiple characters, a combo system, and competitive multiplayer combat, this was a game changer to the world of fighting games. By this point, Nintendo already had a snug affiliation with Capcom, and so a home port on the Super Nintendo was inevitable. Arriving on June the 10th, 1992 in Japanese markets and developed in-house by Capcom, it was the first game to utilise a 16 megabit cartridge for the platform, and paved the way for Nintendo to claw back the Western gaming market from Sega's 16-bit machine, with the game arriving in North America by August and Europe before the year was out. Sega, however, weren't going to sit on their laurels and have the world chant, "If you want Street Fighter, you need a Super Nintendo," and they duly approached Capcom, who in turn spoke to Capcom Japan, and a deal was made, much to Nintendo's surprise and horror. The exclusivity licensing agreement already in place with Nintendo meant Street Fighter 2 couldn't be ported to another console. However, during March 1992, Capcom had released a new arcade cabinet, Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, and being a different game with a different title, it was ripe for the picking. Although games licensed from Capcom had been released for the MegaDrive before, they were all developed internally by Sega. This would be the first MegaDrive game to be published and developed by Capcom, although to begin with, Capcom Japan actually outsourced the development to another company. This other company remains unidentified officially, but perhaps there are clues as to who it is. Now, this was normal procedure for Capcom, however it does suggest a certain degree of less care shown towards the Sega release from the outset. But regardless, as 1993 came about, 2 things happened. The first was news spread to Sega that Nintendo had swiped up rights to Street Fighter 2 Turbo. The MegaDrive might have been destined for the Champion Edition, allowing you to play as the boss characters or use the same character in a 2-player match, but the Super Nintendo would trump them again with 15% faster gameplay and new character moves. Again, subtle changes which made a lot of difference. Sega got wind of this and made sure that the MegaDrive release would have these new features as well. The second thing to happen was by the spring, Capcom had an early build of the MegaDrive Champion Edition back from their outsourced developers to demonstrate to their marketing guys at Capcom in America. But the team in charge of development at Capcom Japan weren't happy with the results. Joe Morisi and the team in America were keen to get it polished up and released to meet the summer launch date, especially with Mortal Kombat on the horizon, but were outvoted by Japan, which led to Capcom taking the game in-house and developing it themselves. Now, this original version seems likely to have produced the screenshots which graced the pages of Sega Power by June 93, bearing in mind it takes a month or so to edit the article and wait for the next issue, especially with distribution times, and as you can see it has a whopping black bar at the top of the screen, behind the energy bars. Alone, this was enough to cause uproar and upset in the Sega fanbase. Here was the Super Nintendo with its larger screen and more polished look, and here was our version a year later and looking half as good. There was also this early advert preview with the same black bars, same backgrounds and same sprites as we see in the Sega Power screenshots, although with the name Branca rather than Blanca, which we can assume was a pronunciation error, lost in translation and easily changed in subsequent builds. So the question is this Street Fighter 2 Turbo Beta Edition the original version destined for the MegaDrive? Developed outside of Capcom and then rejected in the spring of 1993 in place of an in-house development? Well, it certainly could be. Let's take a look at the evidence. Number 1. The most obvious difference is that this beta version doesn't have the same black bar at the top, which was the main gripe from those screenshots. However, apart from that, everything seems to match. The sprites match, the backgrounds match, as does the character select screen, apart from some tweaks to the face tiles. If you compare these elements to the release game, they're all different. I mean, they're pretty similar as they're all based directly from the arcade graphics, but the differences suggest the final version graphics have their own origins. So maybe the outsourced developers got a bit further along with their programming before they were told to stop. That would explain why the black bars are gone, and also explain the Street Fighter 2 Turbo logo indicating changes were being made to the game to bring it up to Sega's demands. Number 2. You might say, well, maybe this beta is just an early version of Capcom's in-house development, and they changed the artwork, which is indeed possible. But as well as not really fitting with the timeline, the coding for these two ROMs is drastically different. The beta is coded much more like a traditional Sega release, whereas the final Capcom version follows very different conventions. One obvious difference pointed out between this and the released version is the much clearer speech in the beta, which uses a more traditional sound engine, compared to the bespoke Capcom engine, which produces compressed screeches in the final game, utilising split sound channels. Recent homebrew patches have managed to improve the Capcom engine drastically without increasing the size of a ROM to exceed the 24 megabit size of a released cartridge, suggesting it was somewhat rushed. The sound engine for the beta is apparently the same sound engine used in Mega Man The Wily Wars, which is a Capcom published title developed by Minakuchi Engineering. So who knows, maybe this was the original developer of a Street Fighter 2 beta. Number 3. Most of the assets, including graphical assets in the final game, appear to be ported directly from Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo, indicating that an internal Capcom team simply ported their existing development over to the MegaDrive hardware. If you compare the assets with the beta version, they are different, and it's not like they're bad different, so there wouldn't be any reason to completely redo them unless this beta ROM was abandoned. In fact, some of the beta sprites actually look more closely aligned with the arcade sprites. Now, whether you think they appear better because of this or just unenhanced is subjective. Take Ryu or Ryu, however you want to pronounce it. Apart from palette differences, the Super Nintendo and MegaDrive releases are identical. However, the Turbo Beta noticeably has a slightly different posture, the belt hangs differently, his left trouser leg opening is higher, as is his fist, along with various other alterations, and this is taken from the same point of animation as the other versions. Some also have a few extra frames of animation in them, such as Chun-Li's spinning bird kick. Number 4. If the original was abandoned in the spring, then it leaves time for Capcom to port over their Super Nintendo version and make the additional changes for the Mega Drive release on September the 28th. We're talking about 6 months, which is tight, but doable. It also allows Capcom to convert code from the Turbo Edition from the Super Nintendo, released in July of '93, and incorporate all the additional features Sega required to turn it into the Special Champion Edition, which allows players to either use Turbo Hyper Fighting or Champion Edition gameplay.
Let's check it out. Did you see that new move? Oh, that was bad.
The color and graphics are excellent. Dancing so fast, I played every day.
This is the best.
Now, there are rumours, and indeed often pictures, of a prototype Champion Edition doing the rounds as well. But from what I can tell from screenshots, this is just the Turbo Beta in an early stage of development. Often the screenshots are stretched, making them appear distorted and different, and there's often a different colour palette, but otherwise everything seems the same. So if all this tallies, and I believe it does, and this scenario is the reality, then I guess the question is, why did they want to abandon this Turbo Beta? I mean, it looks pretty good, and it plays reasonably well. Well, the Capcom development team apparently weren't happy with the coding under the hood. It's hard to see this from a gaming point of view, but maybe adding the turbo speed into this version wouldn't have been feasible. Maybe finishing up the game with the additional features would have meant an even bigger cartridge than the 16 megabit allocated for the development, and Capcom weren't happy with allowing 24 megabits unless it was an in-house creation. So maybe pride in the Super Nintendo release meant they were keen to create a game to the same standards as what is still Capcom's biggest selling home computer version, at 6.3 million units on the original Super Nintendo incarnation. Further to this, recall how I suggested the developer may have been Minakuchi Engineering. Capcom artist Keiji Uefon has actually claimed that their development of Mega Man The Wily Wars was slow going and described the debugging procedure as an absolute nightmare, lending credence to the team's view that the coding for Street Fighter 2 Beta really wasn't that great and they were encountering the same issues. And this could have been the case even if it was a different developer. But what does seem to be clear is that feedback was poor, even apparently from a player's perspective. And although it looks good upon playing this version myself, it feels just a bit lifeless and unresponsive, not really like Street Fighter 2 we know and love. Capcom's development team then probably felt the delay was worth it in order to retain their credibility and produce something which at the very least was on par with their Super Nintendo release, along with the added bonus of then being an in-house production. After all, this was an expensive 24 megabit cartridge, 8 more than the original Super Nintendo release. Acknowledging it's only a beta, although a pretty reasonable one at that, there are still a lot of things which fall short on the polish. In addition to what we've covered, we don't have the arcade attract mode like the Special Champion Edition does on the Mega Drive. The speech samples do sound better, but perhaps due to that, the sound is choppier and often samples don't play at all. The music is also a tad anemic on the beta release, and of course, more importantly, despite its name, it still lacks all the turbo features. There are various differences all over which lack the polish of the final game, and you might suggest they could have been sorted, but the question is, at what cost? Now, peeking inside the ROM is just a tad outside my programming abilities scope, but it's actually quite interesting if you dig around in the beta ROM because you can unearth things like these names, which appear to be the developers' names, or pseudonyms at the very least, none of which seem to be affiliated with the released version, and all of which appear fairly elusive through internet searches. You can also see that the headers indicate the game title is actually Arm Wrestling, although this doesn't help much with investigation because it appears on a number of extracted ROM files. In any case, this has been an incredibly fun investigation for me, and of course I may be totally wrong, but this feels like the best fit given my humble knowledge. I've actually fired off a few messages to some of the people involved to see if they can corroborate all of this. Of course, I could have waited for solid confirmation, but aside from the fact I may never hear back, that's really not the fun part for me. I love the actual mystery. I love discussing differences between screenshots and working out what goes where. It feels like being back in the playground in the early 90s and debating with friends over early screenshots of the latest game in an issue of Mean Machine's Sega. As with life, it's about the journey rather than the destination. So I hope you appreciated the journey at least, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Oh, but there's one last mystery I want to clear up, and it's concerning Father Ted. Our viewers outside of the UK, you might have to bear with us. So, issue 17 of Games TM printed an article regarding a Street Fighter 2 game Father Damien Damo Lennon was playing with Father Dougal. And what version is it they're playing? Well, it looks like the early MegaDrive prototype from the screenshots, right? Now, this is what a lot of readers thought, perplexed about how they were playing this prototype. Bearing in mind this episode aired in 1996, it makes little sense, right? The joysticks might indicate that it's one of the home computer versions, but apparently with several letters back and forth to Games TM, the show's producer, Graham Linehan, gave the devastating news that the joysticks weren't actually plugged in. Anyway, this information appears on several current and archived websites, with people still umming and ahhing about it. But here's the thing, looking at it from the off, to me it's clearly Super Street Fighter 2 on the Amiga. The first giveaway is the screen is shunted to the right, which is common on Amiga games. The second, and really the definitive proof, is placing the two games side by side. Everything matches perfectly. And the third is, you can actually see the Amiga 600 there. So that's it, there's nothing more to it. Which brings this case to a close. I love mysteries. To be a fictional detective, everything would be so much simpler then. Thanks for watching this investigation. I appreciate you sticking to the end. Please click subscribe or contribute if you fancy it, but in any case, have a great evening.